recollections growing up, I lived with my mother. My father had left, and I didn't know where my father was, and I didn't know who my father was. And it wasn't until I was like 4 years old that he showed up one day, and my mother said, "You know, son, your father's coming to visit you." And I was so happy, I was so overjoyed. I wanted to see and know who my father was. And so when he comes to pick me up, my mother had me dressed up in a nice little suit with a little vest. I remember I used to have a picture of it. And my dad showed up, and he was dressed in a suit with a little hat on. And he picked me up and took me downtown Stockton to the pool hall. And he introduced me to all his friends and stuff. And, "Hey, Adolf, this is your son." You're my son. My dad was like, "Really? Yeah, this is my son." But all the time he was drinking, him and his friends. And he gave me, like Forrest Gump in the movie Forrest Gump, I had like 10 sodas. They just kept bringing me sodas, and I just kept drinking them and drinking them. And then I went back home with my mother, and I didn't see my father again for a number of years. And then he had went to Oregon to work in the apples with some of his friends, and to look for my grandfather on my grandmother's side. They lived up in Oregon, Bareilles. And so my father, when he finally came back and I met him again the next time, now my mother and father got together and we moved in with my father. All three of us, we became a family again. When my mother and father got back together again, we moved to a little town called Port Costa. It's over by Martinez and Vallejo, right kind of in between them. And my father got a job working for the railroad on the track gang. My grandfather had already worked on the track gang, and my grandfather at that time was just this wonderful man who took me for walks with him, took me up in the mountains. He could talk to the birds. He was from Mexico, from the old country up in the mountains somewhere. And he used to say, he'd see the birds and he'd say, "Listen, listen, can you hear them?" He said, "They're saying, tortilla con chile, tortilla con chile." And he made the sounds like the birds, And he had one of those slings like David and Goliath, where you'd put a rock in it and you'd swirl around and throw it. And he could actually hit birds and knock them out of the trees. And he knew how to cook them with the mud, where you put the mud around them and then you put them in the coals. And then when you pulled the mud off, most of the feathers and everything, and there's just this little skinny bird, And he would tell me stories about, living in Mexico up in the mountains. And he would take me down my grandmother lived upstairs, and my grandfather lived downstairs in the basement. And he would take me down there, and he was an alcoholic too. He drank all the time, but he drank wine. He had big gallons of wine, and he'd be drinking, and he'd, come here. And then he'd say, he taught me how to sing some songs, and then he taught me how to project myself, and he played the violin. He'd be playing his little violin, and "Allá negran so grande, allá," and he'd take me to the bars, and I'd sing inside the bars, and they'd give me change. They'd throw change on the floor and stuff, and I'd go pick it out. I said, "Hey, this is cool," And then when my father came to live with us in Port Costa, he was working on the track gang also, and then later on, he got a job in Vallejo working on the nuclear submarines at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. And my mother, those were good times in our lives, where we ate regularly. I had to get up early in the morning and go to the restaurant with my mother because she was a waitress, and I would help her set everything up and get things ready. And then I'd work in there until it was time for me to go to school. And then I'd walk to school, go to school. And when it was over, I'd come back and I'd work in the restaurant and help her clean up and close up, because there was no daycare. That was daycare, And so from very early on, I learned how to work, and it was always wonderful to have money. My friends didn't have money. I had money, And then one day, my father was an alcoholic, during that period of time. And he drank all the time. And my mother I could see it was depressing for her. He would come into the restaurant and he would be so drunk that he could barely hold his head up. And he'd say to my mother, Josie, 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 give me some money, give me some money. She'd say, Adolf, I don't have any money. Give me some money, give me some money. So my mother we had a little plastic pig and we put all our tips in there and stuff. And she went and she grabbed that little pig and she threw it at him and said, here, take it. And so he picked up that little pig and stumbled out of the restaurant. And I looked at my mom and she said, son, I just needed to get him out of here. She said, don't worry about the money. Okay, Mom, I won't, And, I had a deep love for my mother. She taught me how to sew. She taught me how to cook. She taught me how to clean, how to do all kinds of things. She said, because you may not get married. You may be a bachelor, son.